Hello, I'm Rachael Latta, a horticulture major here at Colorado State University. Today we are going to learn about the codling moth, the scientific name Cydia palmanella. First off, I'd like to thank Whitney Cranshaw for letting me use his pics and information. He was a great help into developing this presentation. I'd also like to thank Extension staff, Allison O'Connor, Mary Small, Martha Solins, and Ruth Wilson for their help in creating this opportunity for me. And then I'd also like to thank my academic advisor, Mike Martin here at CSU, for also helping me set up this opportunity. So the picture in the background is of Cedar Ridge, Colorado, which is my hometown and where I grew up. It's a large fruit production area, lots of apples, peaches, and cherries, and codling moth is one of the major pests of this area. I'm no expert at anything related to this PowerPoint, but I have had some experience when I worked in an orchard a couple summers ago and had firsthand experience monitoring the codling moth. And so I'm going to share a little bit of information about what I know and then lots of expert advice from Dr. Cranshaw and others as well. This is the extension publication that I got a lot of my information from. It's a great resource for extra details or more in-depth information. If you'd like to learn more, you're welcome to find this online at the CSU Extension website. So this pest is not the cuddly moth, but in fact it is called the codling moth. It originated in Asia Minor and has been in North America for more than 200 years. Typically it's found in most temperate apple growing regions of the world, of which the US is the second largest apple producer behind China. Other apple producing countries include Poland, Italy, and France. So wherever apple production is around the world, this pest also can be found. And what you may not know is that you have probably come in contact with this pest through children's literature. So here's the storybook version of the codling moth. So is the typical worm found in an apple. But in reality, it's this gross looking caterpillar that ruins apples and also ruins appetites. So why does this insect matter to humans? It affects both edible and ornamental plants. So some of its hosts are apples, pears, quince, hawthorns, crabapples, and walnuts. So you have both edible and ornamental varieties that the codling moth affects. So how can we identify if we have codling moth in our fruit? You'll most likely see frass coming from holes in the fruit. You might cut open an apple and see pale pinkish larvae with a dark head capsule. If you're looking around, you may see small gray adult moths that have copper-tipped wings, and they're pretty small, about 3/8 of an inch long. And both the adults and the larvae are the most common forms that you'll see. And these might produce light generalized feeding on the leaves, but the main damage is found within the apple itself. The picture on the bottom right is of a pupa. This one is the form you may not see very often because they hide under debris and bark in order to complete their life cycle. So you mainly see the adult and the larvae. The eggs are also very small, so you may not see them as well. But these are some of the signs that you can use to identify whether or not you have codling moth in your apples. The picture on the left is of an adult codling moth. You'll see this kind of gray mottlings on the entire body as well as the copper tip on the back of the wings. And then the picture on the right is of larval damage to developing fruit. So you see burrowing tunnels with lots of frass coming out of them. These stings can be both on the sides of the fruit and mainly at the calyx end or in between developing fruits. Here's a more detailed picture of a larva burrowing into the core of the fruit. They mainly feed on the core, so any tunneling through the rest of the fruit is just a highway for them to get to the middle. And you can also see frass filling up this tunnel as well. Eggs are very tiny and very hard to see as they can kind of be translucent. But if you're lucky enough and sharp enough eyed to see them, you can tell how close they are to hatching. So the red ring stage happens about midway through development, so you'll see a little red ring appearing in the center of the egg. And just before the eggs hatch, you'll observe a dark spot, which is the head capsule of the larva. So first egg hatch typically occurs shortly after petal fall. So the main damage that you'll see this pest make is on the fruit. So you can see deep entries, which have copious amounts of frass, or you can see stings, which are short little burrows that may have not been successful because the larvae died, a predator ate it, or it gave up on entering this apple. The main problem that occurs, besides the fact that you have a worm in your apple, is that it can allow secondary organisms like bacteria and fungi to penetrate the fruit and cause decay. And these damages can also make fruit unmarketable because no one wants to buy an apple that has this gross frass hanging off of it, or if you were to bite into it, then you would be eating the larva as well. So this is the main damage that this pest causes. You'll also see, if you're lucky enough to look under bark or debris nearby, the dormant full-grown larva, which is how this pest overwinters. So it's a full-grown larva, it just hasn't completed pupation yet, and then pupation occurs in late winter, early spring. So it finds a nice spot to hide out, spins a silken cocoon, and then finishes pupation in the late winter to early spring before it emerges as an adult. So here's a general life cycle of the codling moth. You have adults who lay eggs on leaves or fruit. The egg develops, the larva hatches, and then it burrows into nearby fruit. After it is finished its 5 larval instars, it then exits the fruit to seek shelter and to pupate under loose bark, nearby debris, or other shelter nearby. And then it overwinters as that dormant larva that we saw on the last slide, and then emerges as an adult. And if it's still early enough in the season, you can have 2 to 3 generations per growing season. So instead of overwintering, pupation happens quicker, and then the adults emerge, lay eggs, and the whole cycle happens again. So for control, the best points in this life cycle are to target when the insect is vulnerable and not protected. So in this life cycle, this would be before the larva burrows into the fruit, because after that, strategies are pretty ineffective because the fruit is protecting the larvae from chemical sprays, from natural predators, or from other control methods. So before the larva burrows into the fruit is the best time to enact any control measures that you might want to take. So how can we control the codling moth? Well, some controls actually already exist in your backyard even. So some examples of natural predators and parasites are assassin bugs, which is the picture on the right, minute pirate bugs, green lacewing larvae, trichogamma wasps, birds, and bats. So in order to best make these controls the most effective, you want to create a friendly environment for these natural predators and parasites. So you might want to time your insecticide applications to when they're not around, or apply selective insecticides that only harm the codling moth and won't harm any of these non-target animals. And you can also just create a friendly environment through manipulation of how you are growing the fruit. So you can encourage these insects and other animals to do the work for you. One way to manage codling moth is by using traps. So these traps are used to monitor and predict populations. So in this trap in the picture, you see a pheromone, which is the little red rubber lure there in the middle of that picture. And then you have a sticky card on the bottom of the trap that traps them. So the pheromone lures them in, and then the stickiness traps them, and they are prevented from leaving. So I've spent a couple summers scraping off these sticky traps so we can reuse them. So you can count the number of moths and predict how big your populations are or what stage of the life cycle they're in. So in order to be most effective, you want to place these traps before blooming So they'll be ready and available to catch the moths when the adults emerge and are flying around. So generally, these pheromones are female sex attractants, so the males will be attracted to them, not necessarily the females. There are some combinations of pheromones that attract both, but generally you're monitoring male flights to predict when to enact your control measures. Here's an example of a trap. So you have the orange covering, which protects the outside from weather and rain and other events. And then you have the lure, which is the little gray plug there in the middle. And then you have the sticky card on the bottom. So this is the general setup of a trap, and there's other models and designs out there for you to use as well. Another way to manage codling moth is using degree days. So these are used to time insecticide applications and to match emergence and flights. So it's an easy calculation to know when the moths are flying around and they're emerging from pupation. So you use temperature thresholds of both 50 degrees at the lower end and 88 degrees on the top end. And so to calculate degree days, you take the average temperature for a day minus the base temperature at which the insect does not develop. So that lower threshold for codling moth is 50 degrees. So codling moth will not grow very fast or finish development below 50 degrees Fahrenheit or above 88 degrees. So this is the range of temperatures that they do best at. And then you can also use the biofix point to know when to start accumulating your degree days for your calculations. So the biofix point is the date of first sustained capture of moths in traps, and this happens when you get at least 2 moths on 2 consecutive nights. So this is a way that you can calculate when your flights of moths are around. So let's go through a quick example calculation. So if the high temperature for the day was 80 degrees, the lower temperature for the day was 60 degrees, then you take the average of those days and subtract 50. So with this example, you would have 20 accumulated degree days. So really simple math, no complicated equations or graphs to use, just taking average temperatures, which you can use from a backyard thermometer, or you can go on to the CoagMet stations and find the nearest one to you and use those temperatures for your calculations. This chart gives approximate accumulated degree days for each stage of development. So you have your biofix point, and then about 220 to 250 days following the biofix, you have egg hatch, and then peak period for first generation is about 340 to 600 days. So most of your first generation egg hatch happens between 340 and 360 days. So this chart goes up to the second generation egg hatch, and on the western slope where I'm from, we've even seen third generations if the summer is not too hot, but also not too cold. So you can have up to 3 generations per growing season, and that egg hatch can start about 2,160 accumulated degree days. So this is how you would use your degree days to monitor your populations. Another kind of trap you can use, you can make at home. So you can use part molasses to parts of water, beer, diluted fruit juices can also be used. So you just place this trap in an open container and hang near trees, and the fermenting sugar attracts the moths, and then they are stuck in the trap. So maybe not as effective as pheromone-based, but it's also an option if you have one tree at home or you don't want to buy the pheromones and traps. Another kind of trap that has been studied are bug zappers or light traps. So I actually had some experience working with this kind of trap. In the orchard I worked at, we tried out a light lure that supposedly had a specific wavelength that attracted codling moth, and then zapped the insects when they got too close and then fell into a tub of water. So generally, these aren't as effective because you catch a lot of other things besides codling moth. So you can catch ladybugs, you can catch other moths, beetles, as well as natural predators and parasites. So this is generally not as effective, but could be more effective if placed in the top 1/3 of the tree canopy. So the picture on the right is a picture of a water-based trap, and in this example, they have a pheromone in the middle of the green cage, but instead of that, you could use a light or a source of electricity. Just be careful. So this is another way that you could potentially trap codling moth. You can also use pheromones to disrupt mating. So if you have an abundance of sex pheromones, then the males are so confused and are not able to find the females, and that prevents mating, so the females lay unfertilized eggs, and then the resulting generations are much smaller. So you place the lures in the trees, and they emit large amounts of these female sex pheromones. Some examples of trade names for these are isomate, no mate, or checkmate. And this strategy is most effective in areas greater than 10 acres. So if you have a backyard tree, the females may mate on the side of the property or far away and then migrate into your tree. So it may not be as effective on smaller areas, but for larger scale orchards, this is a very effective method as you're able to saturate the entire environment with copious amounts of sex pheromones. You may also use a combination of both male and female lures to attract both genders of the moth. This generally works in isolated trees or backyard trees. So here you see females and males are prevented from getting together. Here is an illustration of how this strategy works. So normally the female emits a pheromone and the male can use it to find her. But when you have pheromone dispensers that dispense a lot more pheromone, then it's a lot harder for the male to find the female and may not even be able to find her at all. Here's an example of a pheromone emitter. So this one just clips to a little twig of the tree, and then it emits a lot of pheromone, and the male is prevented from finding the female. Here's some more examples of some dispensers that you might find. So you have twisty tie ones, more clip ones, and other versions that emit the same pheromones. You can also change the environment to be more unfavorable to the codling moth. So that's what cultural controls mainly focus on, is manipulating the environment to be unfavorable to the pest. So these two strategies specifically target the pupa or the overwintering dormant larva. So you can remove loose bark, wood piles, or protected structures nearby, and this will eliminate places for the pupa to finish its life cycle. So you can remove sources for them to hide in and be protected from weather, predators, or chemical controls as well. If you want to specifically trap them around the tree, you can place cardboard, burlap, other protective materials around the trunk to trap them. So they can be about 1.5 to 2 inches wide. And then during the winter time, when they have migrated into the cardboard to pupate, then you can remove the cardboard and destroy them, effectively removing that generation. Some more cultural controls are fruit thinning and removal. So when fruits are too close together, this creates a protected entry point for the larva. So right here in between these two apples is a protected spot for the larva to leverage itself into the fruit. Also, if you thin out your fruit, you have better spray coverage for insecticides or other beneficial sprays. You can also monitor, pick, and destroy infested fruit because the larva will continue to develop in these even though they may have fallen to the ground or you're not going to use them or harvest them anymore. So by destroying infested fruit, you're destroying the larva inside as well. And removing fruit isn't always preventative, except on later generations or preventing infection of other fruit nearby. There's also been some research into differences between apple varieties because fruit firmness seems to be a factor into whether or not the codling moth prefers to burrow into this fruit. So later maturing varieties have a greater risk as they tend to be softer varieties and their flesh isn't as firm. So planting varieties that mature earlier and have a firmer fruit may also protect from codling moth larva entry. Some more cultural controls you can use are bagging. So you can use paper or plastic bag over each individual fruit. Usually you start to cover these when fruit is 1/2 to 1 inch in diameter. So the larvae are not able to burrow into the fruit because there's a physical barrier from the plastic or paper bag. Obviously, this takes a lot of time and resources, so this isn't practical for a large-scale operation or if you have a large number of trees. But if you have one backyard tree and you don't mind using a Saturday morning to bag your fruit, then this can be another effective method for preventing the larvae from infesting your fruit. Backyard trees can be great for the homeowner, but if not properly managed, they can also be a source of codling moth and cause problems elsewhere. So some control methods don't work on a single tree. Like we talked about with the sex pheromones, you need a large-scale orchard to make those the most effective. But if you have a neighbor nearby or other sources of the codling moth, they can migrate onto your property and then cause you damage as well. So being a good neighbor, taking care of codling moth in your backyard tree can save other backyard trees, as well as if you're in close proximity to an orchard, you can also be a source of that population for the codling moth, and then they will migrate into the orchard and cause problems there. You can also do nothing. If you don't care that there are worms in your backyard tree or that you might lose some fruit to damage from them, then it's always an option to do nothing. Another category of control are chemicals controls. So you can purchase some of these from garden or farm supply stores, and the pictures at the bottom are some examples of some of these chemicals that you can purchase. So no product endorsement intended, just showing some examples of what you might be able to find in some of these stores. So applying these, the timing for these insecticides is very critical. So you want to apply when the insect will be less protected. So that's before they burrow into the fruit. And usually during egg laying or egg hatching is also a good time to spray these. So either the adults will come in contact and die, or the larvae will ingest them and also die. One thing to be careful of with chemical controls that we always hear about is to be careful around pollinators, natural predators and parasitites, and non-target animals and insects, as these can have a detrimental effect on insects that aren't harming your fruit or actually helping control the codling moth. So timing these applications is really critical, and making sure that you don't inadvertently affect other insects and animals is also a critical consideration for this control measure. This chart shows insecticides that homeowners can purchase over the counter. So the name of the insecticide is on the left, and then you also have how often you need to spray these chemicals and at what intervals, whether or not they're approved for certified organic production, the effects that they can have on non-target organisms, and then also the pre-harvest interval, which is how many days you can apply it before harvest. So some of these chemicals you don't want ending up on your fruit or cannot be washed off if applied too soon before harvest. So we'll start with the first insecticide, which is carbaryl, which also goes by the trade name of 7. So this you want to apply every 14 to 21 days during egg hatch and egg laying. I couldn't find any certified organic formulations of this, so if you are trying to produce fruit organically, this is not a great option for you. And it's also very hazardous to natural enemies and pollinators. So making sure that you don't spray it during bloom is especially important, because those pollinators are out working on your flowers, so you don't want this insecticide to come in contact with them. You can spray carbaryl up to 3 days before you harvest the fruit. Spinosad is another chemical. It's derived from soil microbes. So there's a lot of different formulations, but generally you can apply this every 10 to 14 days during egg hatch and egg laying, but you don't want to apply more than 6 applications per season. Most formulations are certified organic, as this is naturally produced by soil microbes, and it has minimal damage on non-target effects, so you won't have to worry as much about this chemical affecting natural predators and pollinators. And you can apply this up to 7 days before you harvest your fruit. Acetaminophen is another chemical. And an example of this, like shown on the previous slide, would be Ortho Fruit and Flower Insect Killer. And you should apply this about every 12 days to be most effective, but no more than 4 applications per season. I could not find any certified organic formulations of this, so this is also not an option for those who want to produce fruit organically. And it can also be hazardous to natural enemies and pollinators. So again, being careful during those times when those insects might be around. And like Spino said, you should apply this no more than 7 days before pre-harvesting your fruit. Another formulation is from Granosulus virus, and this you can apply weekly. So it's a naturally derived virus that happens in nature, and then we have been able to reproduce it and then market it for insect kill. So this is a certified organic chemical, and this is specific to codling moth larvae, so it will not damage other insects because the virus only targets codling moth. And this one you can apply even the day of harvest as well. So this one isn't a concern for post-harvest contamination. Kaolin clay can be sprayed on the fruit as well. This acts as a physical barrier to egg laying and larval entry. And this one you want to do before the eggs are laid and before the eggs hatch, so the larvae are not able to enter the fruit. This is also certified organic as it occurs naturally, and it has low hazard to humans, natural enemies, and pollinators. So this is basically a physical barrier and no chemical action is taking place here. So you can harvest this with it still on it. So you just want to wash to remove the residue, as it may be unsightly even though it may be edible. So these are some examples of treatments that homeowners can buy over the counter and can use to control codling moth. So like mentioned before, timing your insecticide application with the greatest emergence is really critical to being the most effective with this method. So you see about 68% egg hatch happens between 360 and 660 degree days after the biofix point. So you don't want to apply your chemicals too early, as they can degrade and lose their effectiveness. So timing these applications is really critical for efficacy of this method. Integrated pest management also applies to managing this pest. So we covered a variety of controls to use for codling moth management. And IPM uses a combination of these to improve efficacy and to increase control. So the University of New Hampshire Extension defines IPM as ecological approach to pest control that combines several different techniques to maintain pests below damaging levels. So this is not a complete elimination of the pest, but maintaining populations below where damage or excessive economic thresholds are exceeded. So this is proactive and preventative, as opposed to sitting around and waiting and reacting whenever you see a problem. So this proactively addresses the problem before it happens. IPM can also protect resources and environments, as it uses a variety and doesn't rely on one method of control, and it is a long-term plan for management. So we went through a lot of controls, so you may be wondering, how do I pick which controls to use? So I developed some questions that you can ask yourself or the homeowner that you might be working with, and hopefully these will be helpful in helping you choose which control measures to use. So the first question is, do I care if there are worms in my apples? So kind of like we talked about before, if you don't really care that you may lose some fruit to the larva, or that you just cut out where the larva burrowed into the apples, then you may not want to use any controls at all. The second question, how many trees do I have and what condition are they in? So this may affect the control measures that you're able to use, like we mentioned before, with some control measures only working on a larger scale. So if you have a backyard tree, then this may not be as effective to use a certain control measure. So this kind of defines which control measures may be the most effective. Third question, what's the current codling moth population? So how many codling moths are around? And this kind of relates to the economic threshold that I briefly mentioned with IPM. So is it worth controlling codling moth at lower numbers? Maybe a good question to ask yourself. Fourth question, are natural enemies and or pollinators present? This is especially imperative when working with chemical controls, as they can harm them. And then also maybe good to realize if you already have natural enemies and pollinators, especially natural enemies and parasitoids, then you may not need to use these other control methods if they're working well enough to keep codling moth populations down. Another question is, what am I willing to spend on control measures? So how much time and money am I willing to spend on controlling codling moth? And this relates to economic feasibility. So if it takes a lot of money to control it, you may not want to use a certain control measure and may rely on something that costs a little bit less. Another question is, are there other sources of codling moth nearby? So maybe you have a neighbor who may not be managing their tree as well, and the moths are migrating over into your yard. Maybe some of the controls may be less effective, or you may want to invest in other methods. And then along the same lines, what other features of my property contribute to codling moth population development? So when we talked about hosts earlier, we mentioned that hawthorn and crabapples can also be hosts of the codling moth. So if you have an apple tree that you really value and you want to have good high quality fruit, then you might want to remove other alternate hosts that this pest can affect. So you can remove those sources of the population. And then also when we talked about other places for the pupa to shelter under, so old stacks of wood or other trees with rough bark, these may be places that the pupa can also finish their development in. So removing these other sources is another thing to consider when looking at control measures. So hopefully these questions kind of help you get a feel for what control measures to pick and choose from this presentation, as well as others that are out there. So in summary, codling moth control is most effective when you target vulnerable stages. So when they are not protected within the fruit or hiding elsewhere. You can also use IPM for improving the efficacy and long-term control of this pest. So it also makes sense that you want to evaluate what works for you or the homeowner and make the most of what you have, and you can implement feasibility. So there's no one-size-fits-all management strategy. So using a combination and using those IPM ideas is the best way to make the most of what you have and to do it to maximize those strategies. Like I mentioned earlier, there's this great fact sheet that CSU Extension has put out, and it has more details about codling moth management, and it's really insightful and has a lot more details than were covered in this presentation. Utah State Extension also has a ton of great resources and other publications, especially related to larger scale production. So if you're looking into getting some more trees or maybe making this a side business, Utah State Extension also has a lot of great resources online. Here's some other sources that I'd like to mention, and you can check these out later on the PowerPoint as well. And I also use the pictures as well. So if you want to take a closer look at some of these pictures, feel free to check out these resources. And again, I'd really like to thank Dr. Cranshaw for letting me use his pictures and helping verify a lot of the information used in this PowerPoint. So thank you for watching this webinar. I hope you learned something useful, and happy fruit growing.